The In Conversation podcast series with author Nigel Beckles.
Welcome to the podcast.
Get ready for takeoff.
Welcome back to my In Conversation podcast series. My guest for this episode is an author who has written a book about the history of African slavery, Maisie Barrett. Hello Maisie, welcome to my podcast series. How are you?
Hi, I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me.
So what have you been up to recently?
I've committed myself to online studies. At the moment, I'm doing a course on management and leadership, and also the different styles that a manager can incorporate in order to manage his team. So there's a lot of things it involves, a lot of things.
So Maisie, where did you grow up and what was it like?
I grew up in Leeds, in Chapeltown, and I find Leeds to me is a very beautiful county because it holds all of my childhood memories. So it was a very beautiful upbringing in Chapeltown, and that's where all my memories are of my mother, my father, and all my neighbours.
So have you been back there recently?
The last time I went to Leeds, I think it was about 10 years ago. But even before then, I had not been back to Leeds for a very, very long time. I left there when I was a teenager, when my father died. He died in 73, so it's a long time ago. And mother's family was actually living in Nottingham. So as a teenager, I went to Nottingham to live with my mother, and I finished school in Nottingham.
So what was Chapeltown like when you returned?
It was different. I couldn't find the street that I was brought up on, so it took me time to find my street. So things have changed.
While you're an author, what inspired you to become an author?
It was an experience that I went through, in 89. I went to Africa to live with my partner. I went there with my 3 children, and when I arrived there, I discovered that the relationship was coming to an end. And it was at that point, with every relationship that's coming to an end, there are arguments and heartaches. And so I was there for a whole year, and I decided that it's time for me to leave and return back to England. So I took paper and pen. I sat down to write, to express, to tell my mother what was happening in Africa, and to help me to raise money to return home. But I couldn't find the words to express myself. Years later, I discovered that I was severely dyslexic. So I put the paper on the bed and the pen, and I sat on the floor, and I cried and I cried and I cried. And as I cried, it was getting darker. I could see outside. It started to rain and thunder and lightning across the sky. And I just kept on crying and crying. When I looked down, there was a pool of tears before me. And I remember writing in my tears. I can't remember what I actually wrote, but it was at that point I promised myself that if God was to help me to return to England, I would do everything in my power to get my brain working so I could write my story. And that my experience in Africa inspired me to want to become an author.
So do you feel that your experience in Africa and your marriage failing, did that change your life fundamentally?
Yes, we never actually got over Africa. We were traumatized. And, I had to come back. We had to heal. It actually took me 25 years to get to educate myself and to get that experience to actually write. But when I decided to write, when I was ready to write after 25 years, I decided that I wouldn't write about my story, but I would write about the stories of my ancestors, that if it wasn't for them, I couldn't even contemplate on writing about my story. So that was when I decided to write about slavery in Africa.
And what did you discover during your research about slavery in Africa?
I discovered, I had a question in my mind. First of all, I had a question that I asked myself. And that question was, how did Africans, because there are so many books about how we fought against slavery throughout the Americas, but there wasn't enough books that told the story of how Africans fought on African soil. I wanted to find out how they fought against slavery. And I discovered that half of Africa fought against slavery and half was taken out, because there were so many families, children, and men that fought against slavery. And not all African leaders succumbed to the bribes of European slave traders. So there were African leaders who would not even meet with slave traders to discuss about selling their people. And what I also discovered is that in the areas where the slaves were taken from, slavery at that point wasn't going on in those countries. It took at least nearly 100 years for the first slave ship to sojourn to Brazil. And in that time, the Europeans were living amongst the Africans. They were getting to know them. They were building buildings. There was also wars going on because many natives did not want presence of white people, of the white slave traders at that point. So there were rebellion. They were angry that they were building buildings. And there was lots of wars at the time. So it wasn't easy for them it wasn't like the Europeans sat down with the African leaders and say, we want your people, this is how much we want. This is how much we will pay you. No, there was a lot of rebellion going on, and many African leaders refused to meet with slave traders.
So what is your book called and when was it published?
The book is a long title because I wanted the title to tell the story before you open the book. So it's called The Truth: How Africans Fought Against Slavery from Their Homeland upon High Seas and Continued on the Slave Land. And because I focused on Africans, whereas other books focus on the Caribbeans or the Americas, in the Americas, I focus on Africans. So they were called, when the Africans were taken to the Americans, they were nicknamed Guinea birds. So part of the title is called Guinea Birds, Bush Negroes Could Not Be Slaves.
And when was your book published again?
It was published last year.
So what advice would you give to someone who wants to become an author?
My advice is that if you want to write, go ahead and write. Write something, words that come to your mind, phrases or ideas. Tell yourself you're writing the book and write the book. Go to courses. I did a MA in Caribbean Studies and Creative Writing because I wanted to write about the Caribbean and I wanted to be a creative writer. I later went on and I did a master's in professional writing and I continued to develop my experience. After that, I went to other courses. And just about a year ago, I went to a very big event called Bookology. And I met a lot of writers there who were thinking of writing, who had started to write but gave up, and who was writing. But if you want to write, go ahead and try to write and go to courses.
So besides writing, what other interests do you have?
I would love to have my own business. Just before the coronavirus lockdown, I was just about to start a business in wedding and event planning. So I would like to have my own business. I also try to play the piano because I did music some years ago. That was one of the strategies I did to help with my learning before I went to university. I did performing arts and music, and then I did an access course to music, and eventually I went to university.
So, Maisie, what plans do you have for the future? What is on your bucket list?
I have to write an autobiography because that is what inspired me to want to write in the first place, was to write about my experience in Africa. But now I'd like to write about my life. And also I would like to write my second book, which should be about religion. I want to write about religion and mythology, and I would like to write my autobiography. So I've got a lot of writing in the future to do.
So, Maisie, how can people contact you?
On Facebook and also Amazon. The book is on Amazon.
And what about your email address?
My email address is barrettmaisie8@gmail.com. So that's Barrett, BARRET, Maisie, MAISIE8@gmail.com.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Maisie, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Please join me for another In Conversations podcast very soon for more interesting and entertaining discussions. Stay safe.